The life of a baker in the 16th century. Waking before dawn. In the 1500s, the baker's day began long before the sun rose. Without clocks or electric lights, bakers relied on the soft, natural signals of early morning, the first pale light on the horizon, the quiet stirring of birds, and the cool, still air that held the promise of a new day. Rising before dawn was not only a necessity, but a deeply ingrained rhythm of life essential for preparing fresh bread to feed the community. The baker's home was often connected to the bakery itself, a simple, sturdy building with thick walls that kept the warmth inside and the cold out. Rooms were sparsely furnished, with heavy wooden beams overhead and small windows that let in little light before sunrise. The baker rose from a plain bed, pulling on layered clothing made of wool and linen to guard against the lingering chill of night. Outside, the village or town was just beginning to stir. Few people were awake yet, perhaps a farmer tending to early chores or a herder guiding animals to pasture. The streets were empty and quiet, the stillness broken only by the occasional caw of a crow or the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. The cool air carried the faint sense of wood smoke from hearth fires, a reminder that others were also waking to their day. The first task was to check the supply of firewood. A steady source of dry, seasoned wood was essential. It fueled the great stone oven that baked the bread. Wood was gathered carefully throughout the year, stored close to the bakery and arranged so that it could be fed to the fire easily during baking. Entering the bakery space, the baker began with cleaning, sweeping away ashes from the previous day's fire and dusting off the wooden tables and shelves. The floor was made of packed earth or stone, cool and hard beneath worn leather shoes, demanding regular care to keep the work environment safe and sanitary. A small tallow candle or oil lamp might be lit, casting a soft, flickering glow over the tools of the trade. Wooden bowls, sacks of flour, and carefully carved wooden paddles. This dim light allowed the baker to work without waking others or startling the peaceful dawn. Next came the vital work of building the oven fire. The oven, crafted from brick or stone, was the heart of the bakery. Fires were built inside the oven chamber, using small kindling and then larger pieces of wood until the stones glowed red hot. This process took hours and required skill and patience. The baker carefully tended the flames, feeding the fire steadily, while ensuring it did not become too fierce. Once the oven reached the correct temperature, the embers and ashes were swept out, leaving a hot, clean chamber ready for baking. The heat retained in the thick walls would cook the bread evenly and thoroughly. Throughout these early hours, the baker prepared ingredients and tools, measuring flour by sight and feel, and setting aside bowls for mixing dough. This quiet, focused time was crucial. Every step laid the groundwork for the day's success. By the moment the sun began to rise, the bakery was alive with warmth, light, and readiness. The baker's early awakening ensured that fresh bread would soon fill the air with its comforting scent, nourishing the people who depended on this ancient, essential craft. Preparing the bakery space. With the fire safely burning inside the oven chamber, the baker turned attention to organizing the bakery itself. The space was humble yet practical, a place designed to support the demanding work of bread making through clear organization and careful upkeep. The bakery's main work surface was a sturdy wooden table, worn smooth from years of kneading and shaping dough. This table was dusted with fine flour each morning to prevent the sticky dough from clinging, a simple yet essential step. The baker would sift the flour first, shaking it gently through a coarse sieve to remove any impurities like husks, small stones, or debris, ensuring a smooth, clean dough. Nearby, sacks of flour, often stored in tightly woven cloth bags, were inspected for freshness. Flour was precious and had to be kept dry and protected from pests, such as insects and rodents. These bags were carefully stacked off the ground on wooden shelves or crates, allowing air to circulate. Other ingredients and tools were gathered and placed within easy reach. Water, drawn from a nearby well or stream the previous day, was stored in wooden buckets or leather flasks. Since there was no running water, the baker planned carefully to have enough clean water ready for mixing dough and cleaning. The baker also prepared wooden mixing bowls and troughs, carved by hand and polished smooth by years of use. These containers held the flour and water mixture during kneading, a process that required strength, precision, and patience. Beside the work table lay wooden peels flat, paddle-like tools with long handles used to transfer dough and loaves into and out of the hot oven. These peels were kept lightly dusted with flour or ash to prevent sticking. The bakery had few comforts beyond these functional tools. Walls were often bare, but shelves might hold simple jars containing natural starters or wild yeasts, carefully nurtured to keep the dough rising consistently. These starters were treasured family secrets, passed down through apprenticeships and generations. Light still filtered dimly through small windows or wooden shutters, casting soft shadows over the bakery's surfaces. The air was cool, but warming quickly from the oven's heat. The baker worked steadily, the routine practiced, but never rushed. Respect for each step ensured the quality of the bread. Cleanliness remained a quiet priority. Sweeping the floor, wiping surfaces, and washing tools with cold water all helped prevent contamination. Though the understanding of hygiene was limited compared to today, the baker knew that maintaining a clean space contributed to better bread and fewer spoilage problems. As preparations concluded, the bakery was ready. Every tool and ingredient arranged, the oven heated, and the work surfaces floured, all awaited the arrival of the dough, soon to be mixed and shaped. The stillness of the early morning had given way to focused activity, a steady beginning to a day devoted to the essential craft of bread making. Mixing the dough. Once the bakery space was prepared and the oven steadily heating, the baker turned to the heart of the craft, mixing the dough. This step was both simple and complex, relying on a keen sense of balance, experience, and attention to detail. The main ingredients were few flour, water, and natural leavening, but each needed to be handled with care to create dough that would rise properly and bake into nourishing bread. The baker began by measuring out flour from the storage sacks. Exact measurements were rare. Instead, bakers relied on feel and practiced judgment, estimating quantities based on the size of the batch and the number of loaves needed. Flour was poured into large wooden mixing bowls or troughs, often dusted with a bit of extra flour to prevent sticking. Next, water was added slowly. The temperature of the water was crucial. It needed to be neither too cold, which could slow fermentation, nor too warm, which could kill the natural yeasts. Without thermometers, bakers gauged warmth by touch, careful to maintain a comfortable temperature that encouraged the dough to rise. The leavening agent, often a piece of previously fermented dough or a natural starter culture captured from wild yeasts in the air, was gently incorporated. These starters were precious and carefully nurtured, sometimes kept wrapped in cloth, and refreshed daily. They gave the bread its texture, flavor, and lightness, distinguishing it from dense, flat, unleavened loaves. With the ingredients combined, the kneading process began. The baker used strong hands to mix and fold the dough, turning it over repeatedly. On the floured table or in the wooden trough, kneading distributed the moisture evenly, developed gluten strands, and trapped air bubbles necessary for fermentation. The rhythmic movement was labor-intensive, requiring physical strength and patience. Kneading could take from 10 to 30 minutes, depending on the batch size. The baker knew the dough was ready when it became smooth, elastic, and slightly tacky, but not sticky. Occasionally, flour or water was added in small amounts during kneading to adjust texture. Too much flour made the dough dry and crumbly. Too little made it sticky and hard to handle. The baker's practiced hands and eyes guided these adjustments without need for scales or measurements. After kneading, the dough was shaped roughly into a ball and left to rest in a warm, draft-free corner of the bakery. Covered with cloth to protect it from dust and insects, the dough began its slow fermentation. This proofing period could last several hours, depending on temperature and humidity, during which the dough grew lighter and expanded as natural yeasts worked their magic. During this time, the baker might prepare additional batches or tend to other tasks, all under the watchful eye on the dough's progress. Patience was vital. Rushing this process would result in poor texture and flavor. The mixture of skill, observation, and respect for natural timing made the mixing of dough a cornerstone of baking in the 1500s. It was a moment of transformation. Simple ingredients shaped by hands into the foundation of daily life. Building the fire. In the 1500s, the baker's oven was a sturdy, immovable fixture built of brick, stone, or clay and designed to absorb and radiate heat long after the fire had burned down. The process of heating this oven was an essential, delicate art mastered through experience and observation. Before the first loaf could be shaped or the dough mixed, the baker's priority was to bring the oven to the perfect temperature. This began early in the morning, often alongside the preparations inside the bakery. Dry, well-seasoned wood was gathered from nearby forests or wood piles, chosen carefully for its burning qualities. Softwoods like pine were generally avoided because they burned too quickly and left excessive soot. Instead, hardwoods such as oak, beech, or ash were prized for their steady, long-lasting heat. The wood was neatly stacked near the oven, close enough for easy access, but kept clear of sparks and flame. The baker arranged the kindling, a mix of small twigs, dry bark, and shavings within the oven chamber, forming a small pile at its center. These thin materials ignited quickly, essential for starting a fire that would grow strong without overwhelming the oven's delicate interior. A spark was created either by striking flint and steel or by carrying a glowing ember from the hearth. This small flame caught hold of the kindling, flickering and growing. The baker gently fanned the fire, encouraging it to spread to larger pieces of wood, carefully placed around it. Tending the fire was a slow, steady task. The baker added logs gradually, ensuring the flames remained strong but controlled. The goal was not a roaring inferno, but a consistent blaze that would heat the thick oven walls evenly. This process could last several hours, during which the oven's stone or brick absorbed the heat, slowly becoming a glowing, radiant chamber. Judging when the oven was ready was a skill developed through years of practice. Without thermometers, the baker relied on signs such as the color of the bricks, the residual heat felt near the oven mouth, and the appearance of the flames and embers. When the fire had burned down to embers and the oven walls retained sufficient heat, the ashes and remaining coals were swept out with a sturdy brush. This careful preparation allowed the oven to maintain a stable, even temperature for baking. Loaves placed inside would cook thoroughly, developing crisp crusts and soft interiors. The success of the day's baking hinged on this patient, attentive ritual of building and managing the fire, a task as important as the dough itself. Judging oven temperature. After the fire inside the oven had burned down to glowing embers, and the ashes were swept clean, the baker faced one of the most crucial challenges, determining when the oven had reached the perfect temperature for baking. Without modern tools like thermometers or timers, this was a delicate art requiring experience, intuition, and careful observation. The stone or brick oven, thick and dense, absorbed and retained heat slowly. Once the flames had died down, the oven walls would continue to radiate steady warmth for several hours, creating an ideal environment for baking bread evenly and thoroughly. Too hot, and the bread would burn on the outside while remaining raw. Inside, too cool, and the bread would bake unevenly, resulting in a dense, heavy loaf. Bakers used several time-tested methods to gauge the oven's readiness. One common approach was to observe the color of the oven's interior walls. When the bricks or stones glowed a soft, dull red or orange, it was a sign that the heat was sufficient but not excessive. If the glow was too bright or fiery, it meant the oven was still too hot. Another method involved carefully feeling the warmth near the oven mouth or door with a bare hand. Though the baker's hands were toughened by years of work, this required caution to avoid burns. The heat radiating from the opening needed to feel strong and steady, but not searing. Some bakers used small pieces of dough or a pinch of flour as a test. By placing these near the oven entrance, they could observe how quickly the test items browned or toasted. If the flour browned too quickly or burned immediately, the oven was too hot. If it took too long or barely changed color, the oven was not yet warm enough. Timing was also part of the skill. After sweeping out the embers, the baker might wait a set number of minutes, gained through practice, before beginning to bake. This waiting period allowed the oven walls to cool slightly from their peak temperature, settling into the steady heat ideal for baking. The baker's senses, sight, touch, and even smell were finely tuned tools. The faint scent of warm stone, the gentle warmth on the skin, the subtle color shifts inside the oven. All these signs guided the decision. Experience taught the baker to trust these signals, understanding that each oven had its own quirks, influenced by construction materials, size, and even the wood used for fuel. Only when the baker was confident the oven was at the right temperature did the real work begin, sliding loaves into the glowing chamber. This moment marked the transition from preparation to the core of the craft, transforming simple ingredients into nourishing bread that would feed the community. Choosing the right grain. In the 1500s, the foundation of every loaf of bread was the grain. The quality, type, and preparation of grain directly influenced the flavor, texture, and nutrition of the bread, making grain selection one of the most important early steps in the baker's work. The most common grains used were wheat, rye, and barley. Wheat was prized for its lighter color and finer texture, producing soft, fluffy bread favored by wealthier townsfolk. Rye was more robust and hardy, thriving in cooler climates and poor soils, often yielding denser, darker bread common among rural communities. Barley was also used, but less frequently for bread, sometimes mixed with other grains or reserved for brewing or animal feed. Grain quality varied seasonally and regionally. Bakers paid close attention to the appearance of the kernel, seeking full, plump grains without signs of mold or insect damage. Good grain was clean, dry, and properly harvested. Grain that was damp or damaged could spoil quickly or produce poor flour. Once selected, grain was prepared for milling. In many villages and towns, grain was taken to local mills powered by water or wind, where large stones ground kernels into flour. These mills were vital community resources, and bakers often built relationships with millers to ensure consistent quality. For smaller or rural bakeries without access to mills, grain might be ground by hand using querns, simple hand-operated grinding stones. This labor-intensive process required strength and skill to produce even flour. Milling produced flour of varying coarseness. Fine white flour was more expensive and less common, while coarser whole grain flours were typical for everyday bread. Bakers adjusted recipes according to the type of flour available, balancing texture and taste. Milling methods and tools. Once the grain was selected, the next crucial step was turning it into flour, a process that required both equipment and skill. Milling in the 1500s was a labor-intensive task, often carried out outside the bakery, but intimately tied to the baker's craft. Most communities relied on watermills or windmills for grinding grain. Watermills used the flow of rivers or streams to turn large grinding stones, while windmills harnessed the wind's energy. These mills could produce flour much more efficiently and in larger quantities than manual methods, but they depended on environmental conditions, enough water flow or wind to operate. At the mill, grain was poured between two large circular stones. The upper one, called the runner stone, rotated above the fixed lower stone, known as the bedstone. As the grain passed through the narrowing gap between the stones, it was crushed and ground into flour. The texture of the flour could be adjusted by changing the distance between the stones, closer for fine flour, wider for coarser meal. 4. Those without access to mills, hand grinding using querns was common. A quern consisted of two circular stones. The lower was fixed, and the upper was rotated manually by hand. The grain was fed between the stones, crushed and ground by the rotating motion. Though effective, this method was slow and required considerable physical effort. After milling, the flour was often sifted through coarse sieves made of woven reeds or horsehair. This removed larger husks and impurities, producing a cleaner, finer flour better suited for bread making. Bakers knew the importance of freshness. Flour stored too long could become damp or stale, negatively affecting the bread's taste and rising. Therefore, it was stored in dry, cool places, often in tightly woven cloth sacks or wooden bins designed to keep out pests and moisture. The quality of milling affected the bread's texture and flavor. Finer flour yielded lighter bread, while coarser flour produced denser loaves with a nuttier taste. Bakers learned to work with what was available, adjusting water ratios, kneading times, and baking temperatures accordingly. Milling was more than a mechanical process. It was a vital part of transforming raw grain into a key ingredient, and the skillful handling of flour set the stage for the baker's work to follow. Basic ingredients. The heart of bread making lies in the simple union of flour and water. Though the ingredient list was modest, the skill with which these elements were combined determined the quality and texture of the final loaf. In the 1500s, before mechanized tools or precise measurements, mixing dough was an act of experience, intuition, and care. Flour, freshly ground from wheat or rye, formed the base. Its texture varied with the quality of milling, from coarse to fine, but it was always the essential foundation. The baker assessed the flour by feel and appearance, knowing how it would behave when mixed with water. Water was the other vital component. Drawn from wells, springs, or streams, it was often stored in wooden buckets or leather containers to keep it clean. The temperature of the water mattered greatly. Too cold, and the dough would take longer to rise. Too warm, and it could kill the natural yeasts responsible for fermentation. Bakers gauged water temperature by touch, ensuring it was comfortably warm, neither chilling nor scalding. Mixing began by pouring the measured flour into a large wooden trough or bowl. Water was added gradually, often in small amounts at first, to bring the flour together without making it too sticky. The baker used strong, practiced hands to fold and stir the mixture, drawing flour from the edges toward the center, and slowly incorporating the water until a rough dough formed. This initial mixing was tactile and sensory. The baker felt the dough's texture, adjusting with additional water or flour as needed. The dough had to be moist enough to bind, but firm enough to handle without sticking excessively to hands or tools. As the flour and water melded, the dough began its transformation from simple ingredients to living material. At this stage, it was rough and uneven, with pockets of dry flour and wetter patches. The baker's next task, kneading, would develop the dough's structure, allowing it to rise and become bread. Throughout this process, the baker worked with quiet focus, aware that the success of the day's baking depended on these first steps. The simple act of mixing flour and water was, in reality, the foundation upon which all other tasks rested. Kneading the dough, with the flour, water, and natural leavening combined, the baker's hands became the central instruments in transforming a sticky mass into elastic, structured dough ready for baking. Kneading was an art as much as a physical task, demanding strength, patience, and intimate knowledge of the dough's changing texture. The baker began by pressing the dough with the palms, folding it over repeatedly onto the floured wooden table or inside a large trough. This rhythmic motion worked gluten proteins into a network that would trap the gases produced during fermentation, giving the bread its characteristic rise and chewy texture. Kneading was not rushed. The baker worked steadily, turning and folding the dough with practiced movements. If the dough felt too sticky, a small dusting of flour was added to the surface and hands. If too dry and stiff, a splash of water was gently incorporated. This process often took from 10 to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the batch and the desired bread type. The baker learned to recognize the dough's readiness. It would become smooth, slightly tacky but not sticky, and elastic enough to stretch without tearing easily. Beyond the physical transformation, kneading also helped develop the dough's temperature and texture, ensuring an even fermentation. The baker's hands could feel the subtle changes, warmth spreading through the dough, softness increasing, and the surface becoming glossy with moisture. When kneading was complete, the dough was shaped into rough balls or loaves and placed in warm, draft-free corners of the bakery to rest and rise. This resting, called proofing, allowed the yeasts to continue their work, filling the dough with air pockets and flavor. The tactile connection between baker and dough during kneading was a moment of creation, a hands-on dialogue with the ingredients that would become bread, sustaining the community through the day, shaping and scoring the dough. After the dough had rested and risen, the baker prepared to shape it into loaves ready for the oven. This stage was both practical and skilled, influencing how the bread baked and its final appearance. Using floured hands and a dusted wooden surface, the baker gently turned the dough out of its resting place. Care was taken not to deflate it excessively, preserving the air pockets formed during fermentation, which gave bread its light texture. The dough was then shaped according to local customs and available tools. Common forms included round, oval, or elongated loaves, each suited to the type of oven and the needs of the community. Smaller rolls or flatbreads might also be prepared alongside larger loaves. Shaping required practiced hands, folding edges under or gently stretching the dough to create tension on the surface, which helped the loaf hold its form during baking. This process also influenced the crumb and crust of the bread. Once shaped, the baker scored the dough's surface with a sharp knife or blade. These cuts served multiple purposes. They allowed controlled expansion during baking, prevented random cracking, and often identified the type of bread or baker. The scoring patterns could be simple slashes, crosses, or decorative designs, reflecting regional styles and the baker's own mark. This finishing touch, both functional and aesthetic, completed the preparation of the dough. After shaping and scoring, the loaves were placed on wooden peels or baking trays, ready to be slid carefully into the hot oven. The careful handling ensured that the dough's delicate structure was maintained, setting the stage for the final transformation into nourishing bread. Loading the oven. The moment of baking was the culmination of hours of careful preparation. With the dough shaped, scored, and proofed, the baker moved to the oven, the heart of the bakery, where raw dough would transform into warm, fragrant bread. The oven, its walls glowing from the fire's heat, was ready. The baker used a wooden peel, a long-handled paddle, lightly dusted with flour or ash, to transfer the loaf from the work table to the oven's stone floor. This tool allowed the baker to place the bread deep inside the oven chamber without risking burns. Positioning the loaves required skill. Bakers arranged them with space between each to ensure heat circulated evenly, allowing crusts to form without sticking. Larger loaves were often placed near the back, where the oven retained the most heat, while smaller breads were nearer the front. Careful timing was crucial. The baker worked swiftly but deliberately, sliding the peel under each loaf and pushing it smoothly into the hot oven. The sound of bread landing softly on the oven floor, the faint hiss as moisture met heat, and the rising aroma marked the beginning of the final phase. Once the bread was in, the oven door was sealed with a heavy wooden or stone slab to trap the heat. This retained the oven's temperature, enabling even baking throughout the chamber. Throughout baking, the baker monitored the oven's heat by feeling the warmth at the door and occasionally observing the oven's interior glow. Though the process could not be watched closely without losing heat, experience guided the baker's sense of timing and temperature management. Baking times varied depending on loaf size, dough type, and oven conditions, but typically ranged from 30 minutes to over an hour. During this time, the heat transformed dough into bread, moisture evaporated, crusts formed and browned, and the interior crumbs set into a soft, edible structure. This final step was one of patience and quiet vigilance. The baker waited, sensing. When the bread had reached the perfect balance of color, texture, and aroma signaling the completion of the day's essential work. Checking and removing the bread. As the bread baked inside the glowing oven, the baker's attention turned to monitoring its progress carefully. Though direct observation was limited to prevent heat loss, experience allowed the baker to gauge the state of baking through subtle signs. After the minimum baking time had passed, the baker used a thin, hooked tool or the wooden peel to gently nudge a loaf. A well-baked loaf would feel firm to the touch, but still light in weight. The sound was equally important. Tapping the bottom of the loaf produced a hollow tone, a sure sign the interior crumb was cooked through. When the baker judged a loaf to be ready, the careful task of removal began. Using the peel, the baker slid under the bread, lifting it smoothly from the oven floor. Loaves were carried with practiced steadiness to avoid jostling, which could cause the delicate crumb to collapse. Bread was placed on wooden boards or cloth-covered surfaces to cool. Proper cooling was vital, allowing the crust to harden slightly and the interior to finish setting. Bakers knew that cutting into hot bread too soon could leave it gummy or doughy. The bakery filled with the warm aroma of freshly baked bread, a smell that marked the success of the day's labor. Loaves cooled in orderly rows, ready to be sold, traded, or shared among the community. Any imperfect loaves, those that baked unevenly or did not rise properly, were often repurposed as breadcrumbs or used for other household needs, ensuring nothing went to waste. The baker's careful attention during this final stage preserved the quality and consistency that people depended on daily. Each loaf was a product of time, skill, and respect for the ingredients, a humble yet vital sustenance. Preparing for market. Once the bread had been carefully baked and cooled, the next crucial phase was making sure it reached the people who needed it. In the 1500s, selling and distributing bread was a process rooted deeply in local communities and daily routines shaped by social customs, economic necessities, and practical challenges. The baker began the day's distribution early, often before the village or town's market square had fully come to life. Loaves were gathered and sorted by size and type, arranged neatly on wooden trays or in woven baskets lined with cloth. To protect the bread during transport, the quality of the bread was paramount. Bakers took pride in presenting loaves that were fresh, well-shaped, and free of defects. Bread was not only sustenance, but also a symbol of skill and reliability. Customers ranging from townsfolk to local artisans and officials expected consistency and care. Transport methods varied depending on the bakery's location and the distances involved. In smaller villages, bakers often carried baskets by hand or balanced trays on their heads, weaving carefully through narrow streets and alleys. In larger towns or cities, carts pulled by horses or oxen transported larger quantities, protected from dust and weather by cloth coverings. Market days were special occasions, bustling with energy. Bakers set up stalls or joined communal marketplaces, where vendors sold not only bread but also produce, textiles, and crafts. The smell of fresh bread mingled with the aromas of herbs, spices, and cooking fires, drawing customers through the crowd. Bakers needed to be skilled negotiators and attentive to their customers' needs. Some buyers preferred small rolls for quick meals. Others sought large loaves that could be sliced and shared at family tables. Prices were often agreed upon beforehand, or set according to local guild regulations, which helped prevent unfair competition and ensured fair wages. Payment was usually made in coins, barter goods, or sometimes credit, with trusted customers returning regularly to settle accounts. The baker's reputation depended not only on the quality of bread, but also on fairness and trustworthiness in transactions. Beyond marketplaces, bakers sometimes delivered bread directly to homes, inns, or workshops. These deliveries required careful timing to keep bread fresh, avoiding excessive handling or exposure to elements. Despite the daily routine, selling bread carried uncertainties. Weather conditions, customer demand, and supply of raw materials could fluctuate, challenging the baker's ability to maintain steady business. Through patience, adaptability, and connection to the community, the baker ensured that the essential bread nourishment for many traveled from oven to table with care and reliability. Market day dynamics and customer interactions. Market day was the lifeblood of many towns and villages in the 1500s, a bustling, lively event where the community gathered not only to trade goods, but to exchange news, forge social ties, and partake in shared routines. For the baker, market day presented both opportunity and challenge, an occasion to display skill, build relationships, and secure livelihood. Before dawn, the baker prepared for the journey to the market square. Loaves, carefully cooled and packed, were loaded onto trays or into baskets, sometimes accompanied by smaller rolls or specialty breads for particular customers. The scent of fresh bread, still warm in places, was a quiet but powerful invitation to passers-by. The route to the market varied, sometimes a short walk, other times a longer trek requiring careful planning to keep the bread fresh and protected from dust, moisture, or jostling. Bakers used cloth coverings, woven baskets, and even wooden crates to shield their goods, balancing practicality with the need to present the bread attractively. Upon arrival, the baker selected a spot among the many stalls, a place with good foot traffic, shade if possible, and enough room to display the day's offerings. Setting up was an art in itself. Loaves arranged in neat rows or piles, cloths draped to catch crumbs and shield from sun or wind, and signs or marks indicating the type and price. Customers soon gathered local townsfolk, travelers, artisans, and sometimes nobility or officials overseeing the market. Each brought different needs and expectations. Some sought staple loaves for daily sustenance. Others desired special breads for festivals or religious occasions. The baker greeted customers warmly, engaging in polite conversation and answering questions about ingredients, freshness, or baking methods. Trust was vital. Customers needed to feel confident that their bread was wholesome and worth the price. Haggling was common, with buyers negotiating for better prices or bulk purchases. The baker balanced generosity with fairness, aware that reputation in the community was built as much on honesty as on the quality of goods. Occasionally, a customer might request a special order, larger loaves, specific shapes, or bread prepared with particular grains. The baker noted such requests carefully, planning future baking to accommodate repeat business. Market day was also an occasion to exchange news and hear local happenings. The bakery stall became a hub of information, rumors, announcements, and stories passed along between neighbors. The baker's role was more than a merchant's. It was that of a community participant, linked by daily bread. Challenges arose. Sudden weather changes, disputes over stall placement, or shortages of flour could disrupt routines. Yet through resilience and adaptability, bakers maintained steady presence, ensuring that bread continued to nourish bodies and bind communities. By day's end, the remaining bread was gathered carefully. Unsold loaves might be taken back to the bakery for use as breadcrumbs or other food preparations, minimizing waste. Essential baking tools. Behind every successful baker stood a collection of carefully crafted tools, each designed for specific tasks that shaped the daily rhythm of bread making. In the 1500s, these tools were made by hand from wood, stone, or metal, reflecting local resources and centuries of evolving technique. At the heart of the baker's toolkit was the wooden peel, a long-handled paddle used to place loaves into the oven and retrieve them once baked. These peels were crafted from sturdy yet lightweight wood, often ash or pine, with broad, flat blades carefully planed smooth to prevent dough from sticking. The length of the handle varied to allow bakers to reach deep into large ovens without risking burns. Close by, the baker kept mixing bowls and troughs carved from solid wood or fashioned from clay. These vessels were wide and deep, providing ample space for combining flour, water, and leavening agents. Their surfaces were worn smooth by years of use, sometimes treated with natural oils to resist moisture. For measuring flour and other ingredients, bakers relied on simple wooden scoops and ladles, not standardized by modern weights, but crafted to hold consistent volumes through repeated use. These tools demanded the baker's keen eye and experience to judge quantities accurately. Knives with sharp, slender blades were essential for scoring the dough, a practice that allowed the bread to expand during baking and created distinctive patterns on the crust. These blades were made by local smiths, often featuring carved wooden handles for grip and control. To sift flour, bakers used coarse sieves woven from reeds or horsehair stretched over wooden frames. Sifting removed husks, and impurities, producing a finer flour that improved dough texture. The oven itself was a critical tool, constructed from stone or brick with a domed chamber designed to retain and radiate heat evenly. Bakers maintained fire tools such as rakes, pokers, and shovels to manage the embers inside the oven, sweeping out ashes and adjusting heat levels as needed. Oven construction and maintenance. The oven was the heart of any bakery in the 1500s, a structure carefully built to withstand intense heat and retain it evenly for hours of baking. Its design and upkeep were crucial to the baker's success, demanding knowledge of materials, fire management, and maintenance techniques. Most ovens were constructed from locally sourced stone or brick, materials prized for their ability to absorb and radiate heat gradually. The walls were thick, sometimes over a foot deep, providing insulation that kept the chamber hot long. After the fire had died down, the oven's shape was often dome-like or vaulted, designed to distribute heat evenly and create a radiant environment ideal for baking bread. A flat stone or brick floor formed the base, where the loaves would rest. During baking, this floor had to be smooth and sturdy, capable of supporting heavy batches without cracking. Building the oven required skilled masons who understood the properties of mortar and stone. The exterior was sometimes covered with plaster or clay to protect against weather and improve heat retention. To heat the oven, bakers built a fire. Inside the chamber itself, using hardwoods such as oak or beech for their long-lasting, consistent burn. Kindling was arranged carefully to ignite quickly and build a strong base of embers. Managing the fire was an ongoing task. The baker added wood gradually, ensuring the oven reached the desired temperature without overheating or cooling too quickly. A well-heated oven would glow red inside, signaling readiness. Once the fire reached peak intensity, it was raked out or pushed aside, leaving a bed of hot embers. The residual heat from the stones and walls would bake the bread placed inside, creating a crust that was crisp on the outside and soft within. Maintaining the oven required daily cleaning to remove ash and soot, preventing buildup that could affect heat distribution. Repairs were common. Cracked bricks or mortar were replaced or patched with clay mixtures. Seasonal changes affected the oven's performance. Cold or damp weather meant longer heating times and extra fuel, while dry, warm conditions made the process more efficient. Bakers adapted to these fluctuations, adjusting firing schedules and techniques. Selecting and preparing grain. The quality of bread depended fundamentally on the flour used, and that began long before milling, starting with the careful selection and preparation of grain. In the 1500s, bakers worked closely with millers and farmers to ensure the grain they received was suitable for baking, reflecting a deep understanding of agricultural cycles and seasonal variations. Grain, typically wheat or rye, was harvested in late summer or early autumn, gathered by hand with sickles and bound into sheaves. Once collected, it was left to dry in fields or barns, reducing moisture to prevent mold and spoilage. The drying process was critical. DAMP grain could ruin an entire batch of flour. Before milling, the grain underwent cleaning to remove impurities such as chaff, stones, or dirt. This was often done by winnowing, tossing the grain in baskets or onto cloth in the wind to separate lighter husks from heavier kernels. Careful Cleaning ensured that the resulting flour was pure and free of unwanted materials. Farmers stored grain in sacks made of tightly woven linen or hemp, keeping it dry and protected from pests. The baker, upon receiving grain or flour, inspected it visually and by smell, checking for freshness and signs of spoilage. Milling followed, transforming the cleaned grain into flour. The quality of this flour varied according to milling methods, grain type, and local preferences. Fine white flour was prized for light bread, while coarser whole grain flour provided heartier loaves. Once milled, flour needed proper storage to maintain its quality. Bakers kept flour in cool, dry places, often in wooden bins or tightly woven sacks raised off the floor to avoid dampness and rodents. Regular inspection helped detect infestation or spoilage early. Flour was susceptible to moisture, heat, and pests, so maintaining good storage was a constant concern. Bakers practiced rotation, using older flour first and replenishing stocks regularly to ensure freshness. The careful preparation and storage of grain and flour formed the foundation of the baker's craft. Every loaf began with these essentials: a connection between land, labor, and the bread on the table. Milling practices and techniques. Milling was a critical step in the journey from grain to bread, requiring skill, effort, and the right equipment. In the 1500s, milling methods varied widely, shaped by geography, technology, and local resources. Understanding these practices reveals the intimate connection between bakers, millers, and the communities they served. Most grain was milled using water-powered mills where flowing rivers turned large stone wheels. These mills, often situated on the edges of villages or towns, harnessed natural forces to grind grain efficiently and in larger quantities than hand methods could achieve. The heart of the mill was the pair of millstones, massive, circular, stones carefully shaped and grooved. The bottom stone remained stationary while the top stone rotated, crushing grain between them. Millers adjusted the gap between stones to produce flour of varying coarseness, from fine powder to coarse meal. The grinding process was labor-intensive, requiring constant monitoring. Stones had to be dressed regularly, a skilled task involving chiseling grooves and patterns to maintain effective grinding surfaces. Improperly dressed stones produced poor flour or could damage the grain. In areas without water power, windmills or animal-powered mills were used, though these were less common and often smaller in scale. Some grain was even ground manually with hand querns, simple stone tools turned by hand, especially in rural or isolated communities. After milling, the flour was sifted to separate fine particles from bran and husks. This was done using sieves or bolters, large cloth bags through which flour was shaken or sifted, producing different grades. Fine flour was reserved for delicate breads, while coarser flour went into hearty, rustic loaves. Miller and baker often maintained close relationships. Bakers depended on consistent quality and quantity of flour, while millers relied on bakers for steady demand. This partnership was crucial to the bread supply chain. However, milling was not without challenges. Seasonal variations affected water flow, limiting mill operation during dry spells or freezes. Equipment wear and repairs demanded constant attention and local expertise. Beginning at first light, the life of a baker in the 1500s followed a strict daily rhythm. shaped by the demands of the craft and the needs of the community. Each day began early, often before dawn, to prepare fresh bread that would nourish families, workers, and travelers alike. Before the first light touched the village, the baker rose from a modest bed in a small room adjoining the bakery. The chill of morning air pressed in through wooden shutters, prompting the baker to dress quickly in layered linen and wool garments for warmth. The day's work began with stoking the oven fire, a task requiring attention and skill. The baker gathered seasoned hardwood from carefully stacked supplies, ensuring the wood was dry to produce steady, clean heat. Kindling was arranged precisely to ignite quickly, while larger logs waited nearby to maintain a consistent temperature. While the oven warmed slowly, the baker prepared ingredients, measuring flour, fetching fresh water, and readying leavening. Agents, every step was deliberate, a balance of routine and responsiveness to the day's unique conditions. Sweeping the bakery floor and wiping surfaces ensured a clean environment in which to work. Though lacking modern sanitation, the baker maintained cleanliness to protect bread quality and prevent spoilage. As dawn brightened, the bakery filled with warmth from the growing fire. The baker mixed the first doughs, beginning a cycle of mixing, kneading, fermenting, shaping, and baking that would continue for hours. Throughout the morning, batches of bread moved through each stage, timed carefully to ensure steady output. The baker's movements were methodical, folding dough, sliding loaves into the oven, and monitoring temperatures with practiced hands, managing multiple batches. As the morning progressed, the baker moved into a demanding rhythm of preparing and baking multiple batches of dough. Each batch was at a different stage, mixing, kneading, fermenting, shaping, and baking, all timed carefully to keep the bakery running efficiently throughout the day. Managing these overlapping processes required keen attention and a steady pace. While one batch rested and fermented, another was being shaped and prepared for the oven. The baker's hands shifted, constantly dusting surfaces with flour, folding dough, scoring loaves, and sliding them onto the wooden peel. Timing was crucial. The baker observed doughs closely, judging readiness by sight, touch, and feel. Overproofed dough could collapse and lose its structure. Underproofed dough would not rise properly, producing dense bread. This balance demanded experience and intuition honed over years of practice. Temperature control was another constant concern. The oven's heat changed as batches baked and the fire burned down. The baker adjusted the fire's intensity by adding wood or raking embers, ensuring even baking conditions for every loaf. The physical labor was intense. Kneading large volumes of dough required strength and endurance, while lifting heavy trays and baskets tested the baker's stamina. Yet movements were economical and practiced no wasted effort in the bakery's confined space. In addition to baking, the baker handled administrative tasks, keeping records of orders, noting supplies, and planning for the next day. This organizational work was essential to sustain the business and meet customer expectations. Throughout the day, interruptions came in the form of customers arriving to purchase bread or request special orders. The baker balanced these interactions with the steady demands of baking, maintaining focus and courtesy. Despite the challenges, this cycle of preparation and baking was the foundation of the baker's craft. Each loaf that emerged from the oven carried the mark of this careful, continuous labor, sustaining the community with daily nourishment.